Well, hello. Here we are at the start of week 6, and our topics this week are going to be twofold. One is to talk about unemployment and some related labor market considerations, and then the second is to talk about consumption. So, what I want to do is to give you a sense of the outline of what we're going to be doing, and then we'll shift gears to the handout. So, if you don't have the handout, I'll prompt you in a couple of seconds to go get that. What we're going to be doing in this first set of notes is to specifically be talking about sorry, about these two features of unemployment. So we're going to talk about how we define and measure the unemployment rate and some other labor market considerations, and then why do we worry about it? And so in the same vein that we talked about, we worry about the problem of inflation because it imposes costs on the economy. We're going to think about the same kind of framework for the problem of unemployment. Then in the second set of notes, we will use demand and supply to characterize. So this is part 2. So this is part 1. The second set of notes will use a demand and supply framework to describe what we mean by unemployment and consider various reasons why somebody might be unemployed. And then in the third set of notes, or the third portion of this set of notes will be a devotion to thinking about how this relates to gross domestic product, as well as how we can come back to this issue of costs and think about them a little bit more carefully. So, what I want to do is to shift gears. And again, if you do not have a handout that sort of looks like this, that was linked in Canvas, available, stop the video and go get it. So, what I want to do is start to fill in some blanks. So this will lead us up to the first participation question, and the what I want to do is to begin to think about how we define and measure the unemployment rate in this broader context. So we have this very simple economy where the total population in the economy is 65 people. And so in here, when I write your economy and so forth, I just didn't edit carefully. And if we were meeting face to face, we would have had this in a classroom where people would have had different numbers, and we would have had several different opportunities to do these calculations. But we're going to do it once. So, in terms of thinking about unemployment is measured with respect to what's known as the working age or the adult population, and it is even more specifically the adult non-institutionalized civilian population. So, non-institutionalized means that we're talking about people who are able, in principle, to work, and adult means that you're over 16. So, coming back to this issue of institutionalization, if you're in a hospital or in a prison, then that would be an example of somebody who would not be available to work, and they would not be included in the working age adult population. So in our example here, our total population is 65 people, but what I want to do is to think about what the adult working age population is. And so in order to do that, the adult working age population are the people who are older than 16 or 16 and older, and who are not in the military, so civilian. That's where we'll talk about the civilian labor force, and not institutionalized. So if we were going to think about, first of all, just the working age population, we come down here to a variety of categories, and we can see straight away that we have some children in this population who are under 16 years. So we have 10 of them in particular. And so what that tells us is that our working age population is 55. So this is the total population minus little kids. So minus the children who are under 16 years of age. So we take 16 as the cutoff because at 16 you can choose to work, and so that's what the way in which these statistics are tallied. The overall adult working age population is then subdivided into two categories: people who are in the civilian labor force and people who are not in the civilian labor force. And there are a variety of ways to tackle how to get at these numbers. Again, if we were face to face, I would be asking you, how did you start this? What would you do? But I'm just going to kind of jump to one possibility. So I'm going to start down this side of the tree here and then use that as a check for the remainder. By definition, people who are in the civilian labor force are individuals who, of course, are in the working age adult population who are either employed, either full-time or part-time, or are unemployed but actively seeking employment. So this actively seeking employment is something that's important and that we'll come back to in our subsequent discussion. So if we scan down this list, we can see that we have some adults who are employed full-time, and we have some adults who are employed part-time and happy with their part-time employment. And we have some adults here who are employed part-time, but would have really preferred to be working full-time. Doesn't matter. Those individuals are all considered to be employed for purposes of calculating these labor market statistics and then eventually the unemployment rate. So we scan down in here and we don't see any other categories of people who would be defined as being employed. And so the number that we would put here is 25. So it's the full-time employed plus the part-time, happy and not happy employed individuals. And then if we look down this category again, by looking down, what I'm saying is look down this list here, we can identify people that we might label as unemployed. And so we can see here that we have one adult who is unemployed and looking for work. We have another adult who is unemployed but so discouraged that they're not actively seeking employment. That person does not count in this category of being employed. The number here is 2. And so the number employed is 30. The number unemployed is 2. And so the size of our civilian labor force, we could say, is 32. So one way to calculate the size of the number of people who are in the civilian labor force would be to add the employed plus unemployed, and I won't write it in here, but I'll let you do it, unemployed and actively seeking employment. The other way that we could figure out the size of the civilian labor force just by looking at this schematic is that it is the adult population, the adult working age population, minus or less the people who are not in the civilian labor force. So there are plenty of people who are in the adult working age population. And again, this is just older than 16. I have a neighbor who will be 100 later this year. If Well, so she is considered in the working age population. She does not work, but she is a member of this adult working age population. There's no upper bound to the age category. So if we come over here to individuals who are not in the civilian labor force, there can be many people like my neighbor who are members of the working age or adult population, but are nonetheless not in the civilian labor force. So in her case, she is retired, and so that would be one instance. Full-time students would be like many of you are people who are in the adult population, of course, but are not in the civilian labor force. So if we scan down here into thinking about who is a member of the adult population but not in the civilian labor force, we essentially have all of the rest of the categories that we haven't otherwise identified. So we have the retired people. So let me maybe use a different pen color here. So we've got the retired. We have the full-time homemakers. So make this all in red. The retired, the homemakers, the full-time students, somebody who's unable to work but is not otherwise institutionalized. And this person in our population who would like to otherwise be working but has given up. So if we consider this would be 10, 15, 20, 22, 23. And indeed, if we take the adult population, which is 55, and we subtract from it the 23 who are not in the civilian labor force, we come up with 32 who are in the civilian labor force. So at this point, what I would like for you to do is to engage in a participation question, and that is to identify or calculate the unemployment rate for this economy. So, okay, we're going to see this on the slide as we go back to the slide deck in just a moment. But what you should remember is that the unemployment rate is the fraction of the civilian labor force that is unemployed. So this is not hashtag, it's number. So it's the number of people unemployed and actively seeking employment divided by the size of the civilian labor force and multiplied by 100, again, to express it as a percentage. It's a percent, a fraction of the civilian labor force. So in this particular case, the unemployment rate is 2, the number of people who are unemployed and actively seeking employment, divided by 32, multiplied by 100 to express it as a percentage, and that gives us, what, 6.25%. So that's what you should have found for the unemployment rate. What I would like to do at this point is to think about this overall unemployment rate and the extent to which it adequately captures what we want it to be telling us. And so we'll come back to this question, the remaining question on this form here in a second. But at this point, what I want to do is turn to our characterization. So this is the same thing that we had before. And again, the unemployment rate is the number of people who are unemployed as a fraction of the civilian labor force. It should probably not be surprising to you to appreciate that the overall unemployment rate, and the one that we just identified as what's known as the U3 unemployment rate, and we'll consider some other measures here in a moment, masks a lot of what's happening in various subgroups in the economy. So there are very, very different levels of unemployment depending on education, race, age, gender, and you can also look geographically as well. So if you're very interested in this, you could go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and see some differences. Similarly, there are some profound international differences. So this is unemployment rates in the US towards the end of 2019 and in various other countries. Many of you will see these kind of sharp differences in the country studies as you begin to get engaged in them. What I would like to do is to consider for a moment the sense in which the unemployment rate captures the extent of joblessness in the macroeconomy. And so, apart from these differences in micro subgroups, there are two things that I want to emphasize. So, our broad, let's try this one again. So our broad, goodness gracious, our broad question here is how well does the unemployment rate capture or measure the extent of joblessness. So again, in the previous slide, you saw the differences that the overall unemployment rate masks in terms of these subgroup characterizations. The other thing we talked about, but I want to remind you of, is that, of course, part-time falls into the category of employed, regardless of whether you wanted to be working part-time or not. So one of the things, particularly in times of economic stress, that happens is that people are forced to accept part-time employment when they would have otherwise preferred full-time employment. So the unemployment rate would not capture those individuals, or the unemployment rate as we've described it. The other kind of thing that we can think about is the idea that changes in the unemployment rate can send confusing signals. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the discouraged worker effect. And so I alluded to this a little bit in the course of the handout, that there was one person there who was listed as unemployed but not actively seeking employment, and we said, well, they're not going to be counted in the pool of unemployed. So let's see an example of how this can create potentially some confusing signals. So let's suppose that we start off. So here's our example. We start off with a civilian labor force of 10 people, and of these, we have 4 people who are unemployed, and we have 6 people who are employed. And so, of course, what that tells us is that we have a 40% unemployment rate. Now suppose that times get tough and or tougher. This is already pretty bad. Times get tougher, and one of these people who's in the pool of unemployed just says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so discouraged. I cannot ever see myself being able to find a job. I quit. I'm just gonna sit at home and watch Netflix and try to be chill." Well, what happens? In that particular case, so suppose one unemployed becomes discouraged, then the implication of that is that, of course, the number of unemployed is 3, but it also means that we have one fewer person we have one less person in the civilian labor force. So the civilian labor force goes from having 10 people to 9. And so this means that the unemployment rate becomes 33%. It's a third. And normally, we would say, wow, the unemployment rate is becoming smaller. That must mean something good is happening. But of course, it's far from that. This is a reflection of the economy doing much, much more poorly, but the unemployment rate not capturing that to the extent that we want. We can also see this effect in reverse, particularly when the economy is coming out of or rising out of the trough. We'll see periods where the unemployment rate continues to rise, and you'll see this in a graph here in a little bit as well. And that's just a reflection of the fact that people who were out of the civilian labor force enter in greater proportions than the number of people who are actually finding jobs. So we'll consider some other labor market indicators to try to give us a little bit better handle on what's happening in the macro economy. But at this point, what I want to do is come back to this slide and suggest to you that we can see some of these effects in labor market data. So the official unemployment rate is the one that we described before, the U3 unemployment rate, and it is again the fraction of people who are unemployed as the number of people unemployed as a fraction of the civilian labor force. And you can see, of course, the numbers. Uh, the escalation of unemployment is a result of COVID, and then its recent decline as we've come into the present. This is cut off a little bit, but 7.9% as of September 2020. But in comparison, of course, we're very well aware that the unemployment rate was significantly lower just a year ago. But the thing that I want to draw your attention to at this point is the broader measures of unemployment, the U4, U5, U6 measures. You can read the subtext here to explain the difference, but you can see the U4 measure of unemployment is including people that report that they've left the civilian labor force because they're discouraged. And then there are people who are otherwise marginally attached, and we have people as well employed part-time for economic reasons. And so it's not as if we recognize that there's a problem and then nothing is done. It's just that officially the unemployment rate that's reported is the U3 unemployment rate. But again, if you were really interested in this stuff, you could dig into these statistics as they're released and learn a lot more about what's happening in labor markets. The other thing that, as I said, I wanted to do is to consider. Let's see if we can. Is consider some other labor market indicators. And so we look at these other labor market indicators because of the potential problems that, or the confusing signals that can come from just looking at the unemployment rate. So I'm going to take these actually in flipped order, the labor force participation rate first and the employment to population ratio second. So before we do that, we will have participation question number 2, and we'll go back to the handout and ask, based on the numbers in the handout, what is the labor force participation rate in your economy? So, or in the economy with these numbers. So the labor force participation rate, again, is the size of the civilian labor force as a fraction of the adult population. So what you should have found is that in this particular scenario, the labor force participation rate, again, is the fraction of people who are in the civilian labor force as a fraction of the adult working age population. And again, we express that as 100. Or excuse me, express it as a percentage. So if we come back up here, of course, we can see that there are 32 people who are in the civilian labor force. There are 55 who are in the adult population. And so this would be 32 divided by 55 and multiplied by 100. And that gives us 58.2% labor force participation rate. So what we can do with the labor force participation rate, and similarly with the related measure that we're going to turn to, which is the employment to population ratio, is to get just a more comprehensive view of what's happening in the labor market. And so let me come back into the PowerPoint here and advance to the next slide, and then we'll go back to the previous one. On this slide, what you can see is three indicators being mapped out. And something, if you haven't played around with Phred, that I want to point out is that you can see the broader trend in data. The portion that's represented in the big picture is what's here in between these bands. So what I have over here on the left-hand side scale is the labor force participation rate, and as we'll see, the employment to population ratio. On the right-hand scale, I have the unemployment rate. And so I've taken this from the January 2007 to the present. One of the things that you can observe with the labor force participation rate, so we'll consider that first, is its overall, until the very sharp trend in the recession that we're in right now, the sort of downward trend. So there's a downward trend in the labor force participation rate that might sort of suggest bad things. It's mixed. So one of the reasons why we see this downward trend is just because of basic demographics. We have baby boomers that are retiring, and so therefore, as they retire, they leave the civilian labor force, and so the numerator is becoming smaller. So that's not overly nefarious. The somewhat more nefarious thing that's an element of this trend is that there have been, over the last I don't know, 30 years or so, a trend in which low-skilled workers have lost their jobs to automation or outsourcing. And so if you look at the broader trend in the labor force participation rate, you can see that it rose just prior to the Great Recession, but had been on somewhat of a downward trajectory because of some of these globalization factors. It can also be the case that the labor force participation rate reflects better opportunities. So students, of course, are not in the civilian labor force. So if people feel that they have the ability, the luxury to be full-time students, then and invest in themselves for the future, that can be something that's not viewed with suspicion. And also, if there's a rise in the number of stay-at-home parents because it is a choice, then again that they can afford, then that again doesn't necessarily smack of something doom and gloom. But generally speaking, we would like to see robust rising labor force participation along with declining unemployment rates to suggest sort of a robust labor market. The other labor market statistic that we can look at as providing additional information to the measured unemployment rate is the employment to population ratio. So for this, we look at the number of people who are employed. So this is the number employed as a fraction of the adult population. And again, we express this, I guess I probably should have written multiply by 100 to express it as a percentage. So again, if we go back to the handout that we have, let's consider what the employment to population ratio is. So participation question. So the employment to population ratio is, again, the number of people who are employed as a fraction of the adult non-institutionalized civilian working age population. Again, express that as a percentage. So the number of people who are employed in our example here is 30. And the adult population we saw was 55. And so this gives us an employment to population ratio of 54.5%. So why do we look at the employment to population ratio and also the labor force participation ratio and also the unemployment rate? Well, again, if we think about the employment to population ratio, the adult population, the thing that's in the denominator, is not quite as volatile as the civilian labor force. And then just more generally, the whole ratio, therefore, is going to be less prone to vagaries that are caused by or fluctuations that are caused by seasonal workers or those who experience temporary unemployment due to illness or layoffs or leave of absence or whatever. The employment population ratio then is going to evaluate the ability of the economy. It's an evaluation of the ability of the economy to create jobs. So again, and of course, the high proportion of the higher the proportion of the population that is working should correlate with higher GDP per capita, higher income, therefore, and standards of living. What we can do is look back at the graph that we have on the next slide. Let's see if we can do this. Doesn't seem to want to go. And notice what was happening prior to the onset of the recession in February of 2020, and as well pandemic and its effects in the United States. So what I can do is with this slide is just point out, of course, some trends. So one of the things that you can see with the employment to population ratio, the labor force participation rate, and the unemployment rate is that they tend to lag the business cycle. So certainly you can see the unemployment rate continuing to rise, even though the economy's was recession, the most recent recession before the one we're in, it concluded in 2009. Or March of 2009, but the unemployment rate didn't peak until October of 2009 at an unemployment rate of about 10%. Similarly, that is approximately when the employment to population ratio hit its bottom at about 58.5%. We see this sort of downward trend, of course, in the labor force participation rate, but consistent with the strengthening of the economy from the end of the Great Recession till the onset of of the recession that began earlier this year, you can see the overall upward trend in the employment to population ratio, and of course, the very pronounced decline in the unemployment rate. Again, the recession turning point, the recession has started in February of 2020. The unemployment rate hopefully has hit its peak and will be permanently declining from that. Hit its peak in April of 2020 at 14, a little bit better than 14.5%. The labor force participation rate plummeted, of course, and the employment to population ratio also plummeted down here. You can see the improvement in the employment to population ratio, but we're still pretty long ways away from where we were prior to the onset of the recession. Similarly, if we look at the labor force participation rate, even if we say that was sort of holding steady, we're a long ways away from it. The next slide that I want to show, I guess I would sort of think of as an illustration of the OK Boomer charge, but also it's also pointing to the effect of students. So just as with the unemployment rate, we saw that when we looked at subcategories by race, by gender, by age, and so forth, we saw very different experiences. It's also the case that despite the fact that we see the labor force participation rate, say, on this downward trend, so these two numbers are same as previous slide or graph. What I've done, what I've augmented this with, is the labor force participation rate and the employment to population ratio for the prime working age cohort. So people who are 25 to 54 are generally the ones that we would think of as most likely to be employed of the overall set of the population and the civilian labor force. And you can see, not surprisingly, that the labor force participation rate, which is the green for this disaggregated group, is significantly higher than for the overall than is the case for the overall labor force participation rate, and similarly the employment to population ratio. So of course they tumbled during the as this year has unfolded, and certainly the big tumble in April that we see from the previous slide is mimicked here. But again, sometimes people will suggest appropriately that just focusing on these broad aggregate measures, the overall labor force participation rate and the overall employment to population ratio, is drawing in people that we might not want to really be measuring, namely full-time students, and for the employment to population ratio, and or we're not excuse me, what we're not doing in this, the purple and the green lines, is muddying the waters with older people and with people who might otherwise not be working. So, with that, what I want to do is conclude this portion of the notes with just thinking about why worry. So, why do we worry about unemployment? We worry about the problem of unemployment because it imposes costs on society. Um, and so these costs can be economic costs and they can be also just broader social costs. So, obviously, if we have unemployment, the people who experience unemployment have lower wages, lower standards of living, often going forward, poorer career opportunities. When we are experiencing unemployment in the macroeconomy, that means that fewer goods and services are being produced and less income is being generated at a macro level, let alone at the microeconomic level. At the macro level, we'll at the tail end of these notes come back to this idea of when I was an undergrad, it was called Okun's Law. Now it's more of a rule of thumb, but Okun's rule of thumb for rough measurement of the degree of lost output. An additional cost is this problem of hysteresis. So you may have encountered this concept in other disciplines, and the idea with hysteresis is just that the past plays into the present, that you can't strictly put the past in your behind. So, in conjunction with a recession, the idea here would be that for periods for people who experience long periods of joblessness, they're going to see an erosion in their skills, and it's harder likely to find jobs, which can then increase the duration of joblessness and increase the overall equilibrium or long run level of unemployment in the macroeconomy. In the next set of notes, we'll talk about the distinction between cyclical, frictional, and structural unemployment, and I'll come back to this idea of hysteresis at that point. But the upshot here would be that somebody might start off losing their job strictly because of the recession, but the longer is the duration of unemployment, the more severe the recession is, the more likely it is that it's possible for that person to then enter into the pool of long-term unemployed. Um, I include the third bullet point here strictly because it was in the book and we'll try and be complete. I'm not overly sympathetic to this as it is a cost, but I'm not overly sympathetic to it. But of course, the higher is the degree of unemployment, the more it is that the government is spending on income support programs and unemployment insurance itself. Think about now, we had the $600 extra paycheck protection program, and now we have and several rounds of fiscal stimulus to try to support the U.S. economy through the pandemic, and the ongoing discussions of whether there should be additional spending by the government. Moreover, there are often lower tax revenues as well. Interestingly enough, in the most recent report of the federal budget deficit, it was not the case that tax revenues fell by a lot. So the budget deficit expanded by a tremendous amount. Tax revenues fell by about 1%, but spending rose by a lot more. And I'll put a link to that article in on Canvas, or I'll just scan the article and post it there for your interest later on. For additional costs of unemployment, in addition to economic costs, we have just the broader social costs. So unemployment, of course, is isolating and painful. The longer the unemployment, the more we have these other types of bad outcomes from a social point of view, reduced life expectancy, higher degrees of morbidity, clinical depression, crime, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and you can probably append other things here as well. Additionally, there is an intergenerational aspect to this. When parents experience unemployment, children are also suffering, and that can propagate into successive generations. So these are all these reasons, and then you could broaden them out. And certainly in a sociology class, for instance, you might consider these things at a much greater depth than we have the time to do in this course. But these are all compelling and important reasons as to why we view unemployment in a macroeconomic context as being important to address with public policy. And what we're going to turn to in the next portion of these notes is the various ways in which we can delineate reasons for unemployment and the manner in which we might target public policy in light of these differing types of unemployment. So we'll take that up next.